Went quiet the moment my brother-in-law walked through the door. Not the usual quiet you get when a meeting starts. This was different. This was the kind of quiet where everyone in the room already knows something you don't, and they're all waiting to see how you're going to take it. I'd been in that conference room 100 times. Longer, maybe. I knew which chair squeaked when you leaned back. I knew the water stain on the ceiling tile above the projector screen that nobody had ever fixed. I knew the way the afternoon light came through the blinds on the west side and turned everything amber by 3 o'clock. That room was as familiar to me as my own kitchen. So when my father-in-law stood up at the head of the table and started talking about the company's next chapter and fresh leadership energy, I knew before he finished the sentence. His son was sitting 2 chairs to my left, wearing a tie for what I'm pretty sure was the first time in his adult life. I didn't say anything. I sat there, hands flat on the table, and I listened to 23 years get folded up and handed back to me like a piece of paper that didn't mean much anymore. Let me back up. My name is Donovan. I'm 54 years old. I grew up in Akron, Ohio, in a house where my dad worked double shifts at a rubber plant so my mother could stay home with 4 kids. I wasn't handed anything. I learned early that if you wanted something to work, you showed up and you made it work. That's not a philosophy. That's just what I knew. I met my wife, Gwen, in 1998 at a cousin's wedding in Columbus. She was the one laughing the loudest at a table near the back. I walked over because I didn't have anything to lose, and I never really left. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard. Her father, who I'll call my father-in-law because that's the only title that matters to this story, shook my hand that day and told me I seemed like a man who understood hard work. I took that as a compliment. I think he meant it as one. 6 months into the marriage, he called me into his office at the company, a regional building materials distributor he'd built over 30 years, and asked if I'd be interested in coming on full-time. He said he needed someone he could trust, someone who understood operations, not just sales numbers. His own son, who was 20 at the time and already working in the warehouse, wasn't interested in the logistics side. Wasn't interested in much, honestly, except the paycheck and the weekends. I said yes. I want to be honest about something. I wasn't doing anyone a favor by saying yes. The company was decent, but it was running on inertia. The routing systems were paper-based. The vendor relationships were personal and informal, meaning they existed only in my father-in-law's head and his Rolodex. There was no real inventory forecasting, no federal contracting pipeline, no government relationships to speak of. I built that. Over the first 5 years, I digitized the entire operation. Brought in software for route optimization when most of our competitors were still faxing purchase orders. I started attending GSA conferences on my own time, using my own vacation days, learning how federal procurement worked, building relationships with contracting officers at regional government agencies, HUD offices, DoD logistics support centers, state highway departments that receive federal pass-through funding. I filed for our SAM registration. That's the system for award management, the federal database every contractor has to be in to receive government work, and I did it myself because nobody else knew what it was. I got us our NAICS codes. I wrote our first capability statement. I bid on a small contract with a federal building maintenance program in Cleveland, and we got it. That was our first federal award, $47,000. My father-in-law took everyone out to dinner that night. I still have the photo somewhere. Over the next 18 years, I built the federal side of the business into something that accounted for roughly 60% of our annual revenue. Long-term supply agreements with 3 different federal agencies, blanket purchase agreements that renewed automatically because I maintained the performance ratings and the relationships. A contracting officer at a GSA office in Cincinnati who called me directly when new opportunities came up. Not my father-in-law, not the company's general number. Me, by name. I knew those people. I knew their assistants' names. I knew which ones preferred email over phone, which ones had budget cycles that front-loaded in Q1, which ones would give you an extension on a delivery date if you gave them enough lead time and didn't make them feel like you were taking advantage of them. I knew all of it because I spent 23 years learning all of it. But here's what I didn't know. I didn't know that my brother-in-law had spent the last 2 years telling his father that the company needed to be family-led. I didn't know that my father-in-law, now in his late 70s, had started to feel like maybe he'd made a mistake letting an outsider hold so much of the company's institutional knowledge. I didn't know that there had been conversations. At family dinners I wasn't invited to, on golf courses I wasn't told about, where a decision had been quietly made. I found out in that conference room, in front of 8 employees on a Tuesday afternoon in March. My father-in-law said he was transitioning leadership and that his son would be stepping into the operations director role effective immediately. He said it was a natural evolution. He said the company needed to move in a direction that reflected its values and its heritage. He did not look at me when he said any of this. My brother-in-law nodded like he'd practiced the expression. A little serious, a little humble, like he'd been carrying this weight for a while and was ready to bear it. He was 42 years old. He'd worked in the warehouse for 3 years in his 20s, then spent the next decade in what his father generously called business development, which meant he went to trade shows and played golf with vendors and occasionally forwarded emails to me. I shook his hand at the end of the meeting. I don't know why exactly. Maybe because it was the professional thing to do. Maybe because I didn't trust myself to say anything out loud. Maybe because some part of me was still processing that this was real, that this was actually happening, in this room with the squeaky chair and the water stain and the amber afternoon light. I walked back to my office and closed the door behind me. I sat down at my desk and I didn't do anything for probably 10 minutes. I just sat there looking at my computer screen. On the wall behind the monitor was a small framed document, our first GSA contract award, the one for $47,000. I'd hung it there as a reminder of where things started. Then I opened a new folder on my desktop and I started working. I wasn't angry exactly. What I felt was closer to clarity. Like a static that had been running in the background for years had suddenly gone quiet, and in the silence I could think very plainly about what was real and what wasn't. What was real? I had built the federal revenue pipeline for this company from nothing. What was also real? Every single relationship in that pipeline was mine, not the company's, not my father-in-law's, mine. Let me explain something about federal contracting that a lot of people don't understand. The legal entity, the LLC, the corporation, whatever, is registered in SAM. The contracts are awarded to that entity, but the relationships, the past performance ratings, the reputation with contracting officers who have discretionary authority over small purchases and task orders, those live with people. They live with whoever showed up to the pre-bid conferences, whoever returned the calls at 7 in the morning, whoever solved the delivery problem over Christmas week so a federal facility didn't have to submit an emergency requisition. Those relationships lived with me. And the physical infrastructure of those relationships, the contact database I'd built over 2 decades, the notes I kept on every contracting officer and their preferences and their programs timelines, the performance reports I'd documented, the capability statements I'd written and maintained, all of that was on my personal laptop and in files I'd created, not the company server. That was never intentional. It just evolved that way over 23 years of being the only person in the building who understood this side of the business. I spent the next 3 weeks being very careful and very quiet. I didn't make a scene. I didn't walk into my father-in-law's office and demand an explanation. I didn't talk to other employees about what had happened. I showed up every day, did my work, answered my emails, attended the handover meetings where my brother-in-law asked questions that told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly he was going to struggle with this job. In the 3rd week, my wife asked me what I was going to do. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. She'd been patient, she hadn't pushed, but she was watching me closely, and she knew me well enough to know that the calm I was projecting wasn't the same thing as acceptance. I told her I was going to leave. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." She didn't say, "What are we going to do about money?" or "What about our retirement?" or "Have you thought this through?" She said she'd seen what her father had done, and she thought it was wrong, and she was behind me. She said that the morning I walked in there and gave my notice would be a good morning. I want to say that again because I think it matters. She chose me. Her own father had made a decision that disrespected everything I'd built, and she chose me over the easy path of staying quiet and keeping the family peace. I don't take that lightly. I never will. I spent those 3 weeks reaching out to contacts quietly, not poaching, not sabotaging, just letting certain people know that I might be making a change and asking whether there'd be any interest in continuing to work together in a different context. The conversations were brief and professional. The responses were warmer than I expected. One contracting officer I'd worked with for 11 years. I'll call him my government contact because that's what he was. told me he'd been hoping I'd call. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that the relationship the agency had with the company was really a relationship with me, and that if I was moving on, he'd like to understand what that looked like. That phone call lasted 22 minutes. I also talked to my own attorney. I want to be clear about this, because I think it's important. I was not doing anything illegal or unethical. The information I had was knowledge I'd accumulated through my own professional development. The relationships were professional relationships I'd built. I was not taking company property, accessing systems I wasn't authorized to use, or violating any non-compete, and I'd had the foresight years earlier to decline signing the non-compete my father-in-law had once suggested, because I'd had a lawyer look at it and it was written so broadly it would have essentially prevented me from working in my field anywhere in the country. I never signed it. My father-in-law had never pushed the issue. Maybe he thought the family connection was enough of a tie. Maybe he just forgot. Either way, I had no restrictions. On a Friday morning in early April, I submitted my resignation. 2 weeks' notice, professional letter, no drama. I thanked my father-in-law for the opportunity he'd given me in 2001, and I meant it. He had given me an opportunity. What he hadn't given me was an ownership stake or title that reflected what I actually did, or the decency of a private conversation before announcing in front of the entire staff that his son was taking my job. He looked surprised when I handed him the letter. I don't know what he expected. I also submitted the same morning the paperwork to register my new LLC with the state of Ohio. I'd already completed our SAM registration for the new entity 2 weeks earlier. The system had approved it in 8 days. I had our NAICS codes. I had our capability statement, rewritten and updated to reflect current certifications and performance history. I had a portfolio of past performance documentation that any federal contracting officer would want to see. I had everything. The first call came 4 days after I left. It was from my government contact in Cincinnati. He told me there was a task order coming up under an existing contract vehicle, not a new competition, just a task order, which meant a much simpler process. And he wanted to know if my new entity was in a position to respond. The value was around $280,000. I said yes. Over the next 6 months, I received inquiries from 4 other contracting officers I'd worked with over the years. 2 of them resulted in awards. One was a longer procurement that I'm still in the process of competing for. The 4th led to a teaming agreement with another small business that opened up a set-aside opportunity I wouldn't have found on my own. I heard through a family connection, not Gwen, who had stepped back from her father's orbit, but a cousin who still worked there, that the company had begun to struggle with their federal renewals. The contracting officers were not extending on the same terms. Some were asking for new capability statements. One agency had placed them on a watch list after a performance issue on a delivery contract that, in previous years, I would have caught and corrected before it ever reached the level of a formal complaint. I didn't feel satisfied by that. I want to be honest. What I felt was something more like a tired recognition, that this was always how it was going to go, not because I wanted it to fail, but because the institutional knowledge had walked out the door and no one there had understood that until it was gone. My brother-in-law called me once, about 4 months after I left. He wanted to know if I'd be open to consulting. He said he was having trouble with the SAM renewal process, and some of the agencies had been asking questions he didn't know how to answer. I thought about it for a moment. Then I told him I had a full workload and wasn't taking on new consulting clients, but I wished him well. I kept it short. I kept it professional. And I meant the part about wishing him well, more or less, in the way you mean things when you've already gotten far enough away that the bitterness is mostly burned off. The thing about working in federal contracting for 23 years is that you develop a very clear understanding of what your value actually is. Not what someone tells you it is, not what your title says, what you can actually do, the relationships you've built, the knowledge you carry, the problems you know how to solve before they become problems. My father-in-law understood the building materials business. He knew vendors and pricing and market cycles and how to negotiate a warehouse lease. Those were real skills. He'd built something real. What he didn't understand was that the federal side of the business, the 60% of revenue that came from government contracts, was not really his. It was mine. He just didn't know it until the morning I walked out. I'm not telling this story to embarrass anyone or to settle a score. I'm telling it because I think a lot of people who work in family businesses or companies where the ownership is concentrated at the top spend years building something, and then quietly accept the terms they're handed because they believe their value is wrapped up in the organization rather than in themselves. It's not. Your expertise goes with you. Your relationships go with you. Your knowledge goes with you. The building stays and the name on the door stays, but everything you actually built, that moves when you move. Document your work. Know what you own. Understand your agreements, especially the ones you didn't sign. And when someone tells you in a conference room in front of 8 colleagues that your contributions have been quietly superseded by a family name, you get to decide what comes next. I already had. I think about the day I hung that first GSA award on my office wall. $47,000. A framed piece of paper that most people in the building probably thought was just decoration. But I knew what it represented. Not a dollar amount, but a proof of concept. That this was possible. That I could build something real in a space nobody else in that company had even thought to enter. What happened 23 years later wasn't an accident. And it wasn't just bad luck or a family that turned on me. If I'm honest, it was the natural result of a series of choices, theirs and mine. My father-in-law made choices rooted in something I understand, even if I don't respect it. He wanted to see his name carried forward by his blood. That's a human instinct. But there's a version of that instinct that builds something good, and a version that burns it down, when you spend decades taking credit for work someone else is doing, and when you finally act on the assumption that the work belongs to you rather than the person who did it. The consequences aren't punishment from the universe. They're just math. You took something out without understanding where it came from, and eventually the account runs dry. That's what I saw happening after I left. Not with any satisfaction, but with the recognition of someone watching a predictable equation reach its answer. The thing I had to ask myself, and I did ask myself, honestly, at that kitchen table with Gwen, was whether I'd done anything to enable it. Whether I'd been so focused on the work that I'd neglected to protect myself. The answer was yes, partly. I had trusted the relationship more than the paperwork. I had assumed that 23 years of results would speak for themselves. That was a failure of judgment on my part, and I don't exempt myself from it. What I did right was something I didn't fully appreciate until it was over. I had never stopped learning. Every GSA conference I attended on my own time, every contracting officer whose name I took the time to remember, every performance report I documented carefully when nobody was asking me to, that was a kind of discipline that compounded over decades. Not because I was planning an exit, just because I believed the work deserved to be done right. And when the moment came where I had to start over at 54 years old, I wasn't starting from zero. I was starting from 23 years of quietly accumulated competence. That's not a small thing. That's everything. Gwen didn't hesitate. I think about that too. She watched her father do something she knew was wrong, and she stood on the right side of it without me having to ask. That kind of integrity, the kind that costs you something personally, is rarer than people admit. It's easy to be principled when it's free. It's a different thing entirely when it means choosing your husband over your father at the dinner table. What I'd tell anyone in a similar position is this. Know what you've actually built. Not what your title says. Not what the org chart implies. What you have genuinely created. The knowledge, the relationships, the institutional memory that lives in you and not in a filing cabinet. Because when things shift, and they will shift, that's what moves with you. The building stays. The name on the door stays. But the work you did with your hands and your mind and your time, that belongs to you. It always did. I just had to leave before I understood it completely.